Who is the greater military leader, Hannibal of Carthage or Alexander the Great? This question is difficult to answer for a few reasons. First of all, they were alive at vastly different time periods and never met each other. And second of all, they each had vastly different resources at their disposal. To solve this question, I will use a point system that rates how well each of these leaders did given their circumstances. This system will take into account their situation and where the leaders were. Alexander's conquest, his first steps into Persia. After Alexander conquered the rest of Greece, he marched on to Persia and started liberating previously Greek cities. Alexander treated these cities very nicely, offered them economic aid, and even volunteered to build a temple in one. After liberating multiple cities, he encountered the Persian commander Darius III that had come to defend his territory. Darius III had a lot larger army, and at the Battle of Issus, Darius lost and fled, leaving many cities for Alexander to take, conquer, and get a foothold in Persia. After Darius fled, this left a lot of territory undefended, so Alexander took this advantage and marched on to the coastal cities of the Mediterranean. At each city, he gave the city two options: either submit to his rule and join his empire, or face death. By doing this, Alexander quickened up his conquest, because he did not need to siege many of the cities that were in his way, and at the same time, he earned a fierce reputation as someone who doesn't take no for an answer. Using this strategy, Alexander annexed all of Syria and Egypt. And another important aspect of his conquest is how he treated the cities. He allowed them to remain semi-independent, as in they could keep their religion and laws as long as they submitted to his rule. After a few years of Alexander conquering his territory, and a few more battles that he lost, Darius finally decided that he would set up one last-ditch effort that would decide the fate of Persia. This battle would happen on the river of Gaugamela, at the location that Darius chose. Along with this, Darius also had a lot larger of an army compared to the 40,000 troops that Alexander had. The night before the battle, Alexander and his army rested and slept in their tents, compared to Darius' army that was standing in formation because of the fear that would be a night attack. Alexander and Darius both had a different strategy to winning this battle. On Darius' side, his plan was to swarm the enemy and try to get around the flanks to surround and kill the enemy using a horde of troops. And on the Macedonian side, their plan was to create a dense phalanx in the middle of their army that they would use to punch through and destroy Darius' line, leading to a rout. As the battle started, Darius sent his forces on a flanking maneuver on both sides, in an attempt to surround the Macedonian line. Darius' entire strategy relied on these troops breaking through, but the elite Macedonian infantry and cavalry held the line, while the center of the phalanx pushed through and started to destroy and routed Darius' army, leading to his defeat at the Battle of Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela was a decisive defeat for Persia that allowed Alexander to conquer the rest of Persia without another major battle. After the battle, Darius fled, but was later assassinated by one of his own generals. After Alexander's victory over Darius, he conquered the rest of the Persian Empire and finally started his march onto India. His first potential opponent was the Indian king Ormaphus, but after he heard about Alexander's great reputation, he quickly submitted to Alexander's army. The next people he had to deal with were the Asapai and the Asakaoni tribes, but they did not submit so easily. They led a grueling guerrilla campaign against Alexander and his forces, and at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander defeated both of the kings and the tribes, and finally won India. After long campaigns in India and Persia, Alexander's army and troops were exhausted and refused to go any further and finally mutinied. And unfortunately, Alexander could do nothing about it and agreed to go back home. After Alexander's return, he quickly started pulling his country back together, consolidating his forces, and fixing everything he could. Hannibal's invasion of Italy and Rome. Starting Hannibal's invasion of Roman Italy, he originally started in the Iberian Peninsula and made his way up to the Alps in the middle of winter. It is there he pulled off one of the most incredible surprise invasions that has ever been recorded. An invasion that threw the Romans off balance and allowed Hannibal's army to enter Roman soil uncontested. But this bold move was not without cost, because Hannibal left Iberia with a force of 90,000 soldiers and 12,000 cavalry, and about 80 elephants. But after crossing the Alps, he was left with only 20,000 men and half of his original cavalry. After Hannibal crossed the Alps, he was forced to stop and rest. But while he was doing that, the Romans were throwing an army together in a desperate attempt to repel Hannibal off of Roman soil. This army encountered the encamped but not surprised Carthaginian army in June 217 BC. This battle was fought at Lake Trasimene, where the Roman soldiers were outflanked and slaughtered, losing 15,000 to death, and another 10,000 Roman soldiers were captured by Hannibal's army. This victory was one of the first three major victories that Hannibal achieved versus the Romans that allowed him to A. get a foothold in Italy, and B. have a legendary reputation, leading to many of the local Gallic tribes joining his army and bolstering his numbers. After the three major defeats by the Carthaginians, the Romans decided to try one more time with a lot larger army, and this led to the Battle of Cannae. The Battle of Cannae was one of Hannibal's greatest victories, in which he completely decimated the Roman army led by Lucius Aemilius Paulius and Gaius Termandus Varro. In this battle, 50,000 of Hannibal's troops faced 86,000 Roman troops. The Roman and Carthaginian armies were set up very differently in this battle. On the Roman side, there was a dense, heavy Roman phalanx that was goal to punch through the middle of the Carthaginian army. And the Carthaginian army, expecting this, purposely set up their army so it would counter this, in the way that their center would be weak and would fall back as the dense Roman infantry moved forward and tried to push through. But the Carthaginian elite infantry was on the side, so as the center retreated, the sides could wrap around and get a surround on the Roman army. This brilliant tactic by the Carthaginians worked flawlessly, and the Romans stepped right into their trap. This easy surround allowed the Carthaginian army to completely decimate the Roman army, and after the battle was over, there was only 15,000 Roman troops remaining, and this was a major loss for the Romans. The horrible loss at the Battle of Cannae led to the Romans panicking and scrambling to build up a new army. But while this was happening, Hannibal was free to ravage the countryside and pillage many of the Romans' rich estates. Despite all of Hannibal's victories, there was still one thing that was in his way, and that was the city of Rome. Hannibal's generals wanted him to attack it and knock out the Romans, but the city of Rome was mighty and well fortified, and a loss could result in the loss of the entire campaign. So, in one of the most questionable decisions in history, Hannibal decided not to attack Rome. Now, the choice to attack Rome, in hindsight, would have most likely won him the war, assuming he could have taken the city. Hannibal's slow and steady decline. Hannibal had proven to the Romans he was undefeatable, so the Romans responded by attacking everywhere Hannibal wasn't. For example, they sent an invasion force to take Carthage, instead of directly attacking Hannibal himself. This strategy was called the Fabian tactic. To add to that, Carthage had stopped sending troops and supplies to Hannibal, and instead sent them to help with the defense of Carthage itself. The end of Carthage. After a while, the city of Carthage was marched on, and Hannibal was forced back home to defend Carthage, and in the Battle of Zama, Hannibal lost to Scipio Africanus, his one time of losing. In the end, Hannibal had occupied Italy for 15 years. The rating system. Points will be awarded on how well each of these leaders handled the situation and how they won it. But points can also be taken away if these leaders did not manage or did not succeed in a situation. Each section is up to 5 points. Now here are the point categories. The initial invasion of the country or land. This is very important because the initial invasion can make or break a campaign. Number 2, the logistics of an army. The logistics of an army are one of the most important parts of a campaign, because feeding your soldiers is very important. Number 3, way smaller battles or minor battles were handled. This is also very important because this can keep you self-sustaining and actually have a military to fight those major battles. Number 4, the way that the leader's most major battle was handled. This looks into a lot more of the strategy and also looks at the overall effect this battle had on the campaign. Number 5, land that was taken or occupied and how long that land was held. This will look into how effective that person's campaign actually was, and also if it was actually for anything. Number 6, the overall execution of the campaign. This will look at the grand strategy that the leader managed to pull off, and in this section will also be the lost points section. This will look at the mistakes that were made, and this can also kind of tell what the leader should have done in the situation. Analysis. Differences in entrance. Hannibal's surprise attack is a legendary event that allowed him to enter Italy and start his conquest by surprise. His audacity for doing this grants him 3 points. If you compare Alexander's entrance into Persia to this, Alexander's conquest looks a lot less impressive. This is because there's not really a legendary way to enter Persia, so he just walked in through Turkey. Unfortunately, this means he only gets 1 point, because nothing impressive happens. But I do think that if Alexander was in Hannibal's situation, then he would have done something very similar, if not more impressive. Differences in logistics. One thing that is critical in war is food and logistics, something both of these leaders realized. Alexander was a master at logistics, and he knew that it was so important. Some examples of his masterful logistic prowess is how he conquered a city. The one thing that he made sure this city did was keep his supply route open. This tactic allowed him to keep his supply line, even when he was thousands of kilometers away from Allied territory. This gives Alexander 3 points for his expert management of logistics. Compared to Alexander's masterful experience of logistics, you'd think that Hannibal would start to lose out. But Hannibal did just as good, if not better, when given a more difficult situation. Alexander relied on reinforcements from Allied territory, but Hannibal really never got reinforcements, and was forced to live off the land, raiding and diplomacy to keep his army fed and healthy. This earns Hannibal 3 points for his amazing guerrilla warfare. Differences in execution of minor battles. In the grand scale of things, Alexander had a lot more minor battles than Hannibal, which is going to lead to him having an advantage in this department. Alexander has fought many battles, and in almost every single one of them, he demonstrated a lot of skill. But, however, many of the battles, Alexander had a lot larger army and a better trained army than his opponent. But he still demonstrated a large competence in many situations, so he is going to get a score of 2 points. Compared to Alexander, Hannibal had a lot smaller army compared to his Roman enemies. And if that is taken into account, then Hannibal demonstrated a lot of skill, because every single minor battle he fought could have been the end of him. If we take this into account, then we could almost say he has more competence than Alexander, because Alexander usually relied on smashing his enemy, and Hannibal had to outsmart his opponent in nearly every battle. So, Hannibal gets 2 points. There are many large battles that mattered both for Alexander and Hannibal, but I will only be covering one for each. And these battles will be the largest, most important battles, or the best demonstration of the commander's skill. I chose the Battle of Cannae for Hannibal, because in the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal successfully managed to surround a larger army. This is a very impressive feat. Not only that, but also the fact that Hannibal's army was mostly made out of a combination of a bunch of different troops and mercenaries compared to the much larger army of the Romans. This battle perfectly demonstrated the skill of Hannibal and his competence as a general. And for that, Hannibal will earn 5 points. The Battle of Gaugamela demonstrated Alexander's battle. The Battle of Gaugamela was a major battle in Alexander's campaign, and was the end of the Persian resistance, and because of that, I will be covering it. In the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander defeated a lot larger army using good tactics and his experience in battle. At the battle, Alexander destroyed Darius' army using his skill. And for Alexander's excellent execution at the Battle of Gaugamela, he earns 2 points, because the Battle of Gaugamela allowed Alexander to conquer the rest of Persia without almost any resistance. Alexander earned a lot less points than Hannibal, because of the fact that Alexander's army was actually arguably superior to Darius' lot larger army. So, because of this, Alexander will earn a lot less points than Hannibal. In the days of Alexander and Hannibal, land was one of the most important things an empire could have. And after Alexander annexed Persia and small parts of India, Alexander had a lot of land. His empire stretched from modern-day Greece into bits of India, and at the same time, it was one of the biggest land empires around. Alexander was also an expert at acquiring land through diplomacy. Unfortunately, after Alexander died, about 3 years after he left and returned back to Greece, his entire empire shattered. And so, because of Alexander's massive amounts of land, he earns 5 points, even if in the end he did lose it. When comparing land taken to Hannibal, it is very unfair, because Hannibal actually never fully annexed any land, and all he was in control of was one little army with limited manpower, so he could only be in so many places at one time. Where, compared to Alexander, Alexander had a lot more manpower, and so to keep it fair, I'll be talking about the amounts of territory that Hannibal had occupied. Now, Hannibal had much of Italy under his control for a number of years, and the land that he did not have was only free because he did not have enough troops to exert control over it. So, in that sense, Hannibal had a lot less manpower to occupy his territory, but he still did good with what he had, so he will earn 3 points. Now moving on to the overall execution of the campaign. For Alexander's campaign, there were a lot of battles that he fought, and almost every single one of them Alexander won. Now, Alexander crushed many enemy armies that were thrown at him because of the amount of time he had a superior army, and those victories allowed him to efficiently conquer most of the Middle East in only 15 years, leading to his massive empire. This massive empire earns Alexander 5 points for the massive amount of territory he took and the skill at which he took it. Hannibal's campaign was very different from Alexander's. Hannibal's campaign was centered around a guerrilla war that he fought against the Romans. Now, this guerrilla warfare was very effective against their slow, heavy armies, where Hannibal would only take advantageous battles. Now, if you compare this to Alexander's tactic of just finding the first enemy army he can see and rushing at it, Hannibal seems a lot better of the strategist here. But you have to take into account that he only did this because of the limited force he had. So, in conclusion, Hannibal may have been able to occupy Rome for 15 years. He still wasn't successful in his campaign, though. And because of this, this only earns him 4 points. Now we will be covering mistakes. Both of these leaders made many mistakes. Hannibal's main mistake that he made was all centered around the fact that the Romans, he nearly completely defeated the Romans except for one single thing, the city of Rome. The city of Rome was incredibly well defended and incredibly strong. So, Hannibal was sitting outside of it waiting for his chance to attack. And now, many historians think that if Hannibal had chosen to attack, then he would have won and he would have conquered Rome for the Carthaginians. But unfortunately, and despite many of his generals urging Hannibal to attack Rome, Hannibal never attacked Rome. Now, this most likely cost him and the rest of Carthage their campaign against Rome. And this was most likely what led to the Carthaginian defeat, the fact that Hannibal would not attack Rome. Because of Hannibal's unwillingness to attack Rome, he will lose 1 point. Now, if Alexander was in this situation, he most likely would have charged at the Roman city and tried to take it, no matter the cost. Alexander also made a lot of mistakes, but one of his largest ones was letting his army get out of control. This was something that should have not happened, and this stopped his conquest of India, and many historians say that Alexander would have conquered the entirety of India, and not some little section, if he would have gotten back control of his troops, and he would have continued on his conquest. Now, you have to understand, this should have not happened. For example, Hannibal's army, even being made up of many different people, was loyal to Hannibal and only Hannibal, and they would fight with him to the end. But because Alexander could not keep his army under control, he will lose 1 point. Conclusion: entrance. Hannibal earns 3 points for his crossing of the Alps, and Alexander earns only 1, because he had a very standard entrance. But, like I previously said, I think if Alexander was given the chance, he would have done something just as drastic. Logistics. Both of these leaders were very skillful when it came to managing the logistics, but, yet again, these leaders were in a different situation. Alexander was very skillful in managing logistics on a large scale, and because of this, Alexander earns 3 points. Hannibal was in a very different situation, and he could not rely on imports from home, and so he was forced to raid it to keep his army fed by the lands, and this required a lot of skill. Along with this, he also recruited the local Gaul tribes to fill up his army. So, Hannibal also earns 3 points. Smaller battles. Alexander, in most cases, had a better army in most of the smaller battles he fought, and so he only gets 2 points. But he did fight a lot more battles than Hannibal. Hannibal also earns 2 points, but because if he fought a lot of the battles he fought, he was forced to win by skill, and every battle he fought was a risk, unlike Alexander. Major battles. Both of these battles that I covered were major turning points for the leaders' war. Alexander's battle at Guatemala was skillfully done, and so he earns 2 points. However, the battle at Guatemala was not nearly as memorable as Hannibal's amazing battle at Caen, so Hannibal earns 5 points. Lands taken. Alexander took a lot more land than Hannibal, so he earns 5 points. But when he did die, his entire country fell apart. At the same time, Hannibal was using a lot smaller of an army, and he was the only one fighting the Romans in Italy. And with what he had, he managed to occupy Italy for a lot of years. But unfortunately, like Alexander, everything he did was for naught. Both of these people's campaigns were very impressive, and Alexander managed to occupy so much territory in such a fast rate, not to mention the fact that he almost never lost a battle, so he earns 5 points. Hannibal led an amazing guerrilla war against the superior Roman armies, so he earns 4 points for his brilliant strategies. Points lost. However great these leaders were, they still made some mistakes. Alexander's troops were loyal to him, but not loyal enough to follow him to the end, so he loses 1 point for not being able to keep his troops loyal. Hannibal's major mistake was not attacking Rome, and if he did, he might have won the war, and then completely changed history around. But because Hannibal was timid, he loses 1 point for not attacking Rome. Adding up all the points, Alexander earned 17 points, and Hannibal earned 19. Hannibal wins, because he made use of a worse situation and turned it around to his advantage. Even though, at most parts in his campaign, he was at a disadvantage compared to the Romans, Hannibal still pulled through and managed to last a lot of years against the Romans. Compared to Alexander, Alexander used just brute force tactics in many of his battles he fought, because he had a superior army to many of his enemies. Hannibal had no such thing. Well, now, both Hannibal and Alexander, their empires never actually stood that long. They still fought a good fight, and I would say Hannibal is the better strategist here.